每天中午11点50分、下午6点，环球财经连线，让每一次连接都有价值。
而就中美贸易不平衡的问题，财经频道 G20前方记者在匹兹堡也做了调查。一位多年从事中美贸易问题的律师就给出了建议。他说，贸易不平衡的问题可以通过投资来解决。
It's a long time problem of the trade imbalance between China and the United States. So do you think the investment could resolve this issue?
I don't think that China can really control the exports out of the country. I think that is more based upon demand that comes from America or Europe. As the European and American economies are weak, exports from China are down.
温国维，美国匹兹堡律师，专门从事投资、收购等业务，先后35次来到中国。对于中美贸易的不平衡问题，他认为完全可以通过投资来解决。
What I think the Chinese government needs to think about is not to encourage exports when the economies improve, but to encourage Chinese companies and Chinese investors to invest in companies and in joint ventures in the United States and Europe.
But this imbalance...
There was a very large trade imbalance between Japan and the United States in the 1980s and 1990s. That changed as the Japanese invested more in the United States. The important thing is that what China does not want is a political problem with the United States.
Yeah.
And I think in order to avoid the political problem, we need to create closer economic relations.
温国维告诉我们，目前美国的能源、建筑、环保领域都有很多投资机会，中国公司大有可为。
China has a lot of chances, and because American economy is weak, I believe American companies are more open now to investing from Chinese companies than ever before.
G20峰会期间呢，前方记者芮成刚独家专访了国际货币基金组织总裁。
The world's second biggest economy, China, seems to be closing in on number one, the United States. And China's growing economic cloud is leading some to speculate that American economic power and influence may well be at its peak. Well, not so fast, says one expert on doing business in the Far East. There are at least 4 big challenges facing China, and one challenge that could actually be an opportunity here for our region. Unkovic is back with us. He's a partner with Unkovic and Scott in Pittsburgh. And welcome. Good to see you.
Morning, Bill. Nice to be back.
Yeah, how about this? I mean, this whole idea that the United States may no longer be number one, it's hard to believe this could be the case.
It's really not the end of the world. The Chinese have 4 or 5 times as many people as we do. So those who are going to panic saying China's economies are going to be bigger than ours, it's really not a big problem.
And actually, I guess they've been bigger than ours before, if you look back.
You know, it's funny, Bill, in 1820, China had 30% of the world's GDP. And today it's 16%, so it's only half as big as it was. Of course, you have to remember America then was probably this big.
A little pipsqueak.
Exactly.
Yeah, mostly a farmland here, I guess, back in those days in the early 1800s. But big issues, and you've sort of identified 4 big issues that China really needs to work about. One of them we've kind of already spoken to. Big economy, but lots more people, so there's a real issue of disparity there.
I call it rich China, poor China. If you go along the coast, with the Pacific being here and China here, most of the people along the coast are doing pretty well. And some of the inland cities are doing well. But basically, half of the Chinese people have not really benefited from the growth that's gone on over the last 20, 30 years. And so you have a disparity of the rich and the poor like we do in this country, but it's much more extreme. And that's a political problem and an economic problem for the Chinese government.
So a lot of pressure then on the rural side, the poorer people that want a piece of the pie, and how do they balance those?
I'll give you an example. In Shanghai, if you buy a Starbucks coffee, it costs you the equivalent of a full day's salary of a farmer in the middle of the country. And you know what? they know that. And so, you know, somebody's drinking a maco latte, whatever it is, and then somebody in the middle of the country is working and supporting a family of 3 or 4 on the same amount of money. That's a concern for the Chinese government. They clearly know it, and they're trying to deal with it.
You talk about the family of 3 or 4. Are there families of 4 anymore in China? I thought they could only have 1 child each.
Well, that's a great question. They set up what's called a one-child policy 30 years ago. The problem is it was too successful, and now China, you won't believe this, but it's true, is going to have too few workers in the future because they didn't have enough children, because instead of having 1.9 or 2.2 children on average, they had about 1. And so China, believe it or not, within 20 years is going to have a labor shortage, which is going to do one thing. It's going to drive up the cost, the labor cost of doing things in China. So if you're looking for China as a cheap place to manufacture or do things, it's less so now, but in the future, it's going to be even less than that.
So a whole lot of host of questions then about how do they sustain their economy and their global competitiveness.
Exactly.
As the cost of labor goes
up.
Which
means they've got to do higher value things. Otherwise, they're going to have problems like we did here in the U.S. 30 years ago.
And another piece of the people issue really has to do with the environment there, which makes Pittsburgh in the 1930s look like a pristine place in some ways.
You know, we've seen that picture of, you know, Pittsburgh, hell with the lid off, that's oftentimes on brochures. China today has a worse problem than we did 30 or 40 years ago. The reason is we had soft coal, which created a lot of dust and dirt in the air, but a lot of their pollution comes from automobiles, which is much more deadly from a health standpoint. And if you're a Chinese person, you might be willing to put up with it for yourself. But if you have children, you have grandchildren, and they're being affected by this. There are a lot of foreign companies now that are pulling their people out of China simply because they don't want to work there. I mean, you might expose yourself at your age or something, but if you have a 12-year-old child that might get asthma, and the Chinese know that, and they're really serious about cleaning up the pollution there, but it's going to take decades, like it did here in Pittsburgh.
Sure, so another big challenge they have to overcome. Then there's the political challenge of a fairly controlled system politically, but now has to deal with the internet and whole new types of communication technologies.
The Chinese government has been able to maintain control for the last 30 years by essentially managing information. You know, all bets are off with the internet, because although they can control certain things, you can get an IP address out of Hong Kong in which you can get information coming into China. And the problems we talked about before, the pollution or the inequality, those things get circulated on the internet, and it's a challenge for the Chinese government. So I think they've understood they can't control it completely, Bill, but how do you control information? You can't. Look at what happened in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago when they had the demonstrations. In Tiananmen Square, we don't really know what happened, but it was over. Everything was watched, every second, every minute was going on in Hong Kong. And as a result, I think the Chinese government was much more constrained in how they dealt with the demonstrators than they did probably 30 years ago.
It's harder and harder with the technology. The last piece doesn't look like a challenge for China necessarily. They're sitting on trillions of US dollars. But you're saying that actually is an issue for them, but potentially an opportunity even for our region?
Let me give you a figure. The Chinese are sitting on $3.6 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars, which are essentially the yen, the dollars and euros that have flowed over there for the last 30 years. Now they have rich entrepreneurs and they have companies that want to become global. They have to move out of China. I think that Western Pennsylvania is particularly well situated to attract Chinese investors here to come in to buy. I'm not talking about hotels and fancy houses, but I'm talking about manufacturing facilities. 25 years ago, the Japanese did the same thing when they wanted to move here. So look for Chinese investors. There was recently an investment by a major Chinese company in Westmoreland County where they bought a manufacturing company that had been around for 80 years. So it's an opportunity. You just have to be sensitive. Dealing with the Chinese is very challenging. You sort of have to understand them and work with them. But think about it. If capital is a problem or a goal for your company, if you're in energy, if you're in manufacturing, if you're in distribution, if you're in engineering, there is a lot of interest in this Western Pennsylvania. So I think that's the opportunity for us. And if we sent all those dollars over there before, why not bring some of them back?
I love it, and bring them home here to our region. Dennis Unkovic with Meyer, Unkovic & Scott. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. Nice to be here.
And next up, doing business in China. Yes, there's a learning curve. We'll find out about it as our region's business continues. Stay with us.
I am not concerned about the Made in China 2025. Really what it is a reflection of what's going on in China today. China is no longer making cheap toys that go in McDonald's Happy Meals. They're becoming more and more sophisticated. And frankly, all they're trying to do is to become what the United States is. So if we see that as a threat, we're really just looking at, I think, the second most powerful country in the world wanting to become us. So certainly the president, in his own way, is trying to make America greater, as he says. But this is just a reflection of what's going on today.
Do you think that our trade moves are a reaction to what you just said, which is that China wants to be us, and we don't want that?
Well, two things. First of all, China has run an enormous trade deficit with us for the last, 20 years. It was $376 billion last year. That can't continue. So the fact that the U.S. wants the trade deficit to be reversed, or at least dealt with better, makes sense. But the second thing is, we as a country have essentially had free rein on world trade over the last 30 to 40 years. China is now coming into our space and being much more aggressive. I think this is more U.S. versus China than it is necessarily just, we're unhappy with the Chinese.
Dennis, there are two significant issues. One is the giant trade deficit, and the second is the whole basket of issues around intellectual property. When I try to look into the future and understand what a deal would look like, it feels to me like we'll get more on the trade deficit side and less on more IP protections for American companies, because that's so critically important for China, and it's a little bit harder for the U.S. electorate to understand the intellectual property issues. And so President Trump may go for the easier win. What do you see the eventual outcome being here?
Well, if you look in the short run, I think China will really be hurt by the tariffs. In the longer run, I think the U.S. is going to be hurt as much or more than China. Our economies are so intertwined at this point, it's impossible to pull them apart. Whether you look at an iPhone or you look at any other technology-based product, all of these things have parts that come from China and the United States. I think it's unrealistic for the president to think that in the next 2 or 3 months he can correct the trade deficit that's been going on really for, the last 30 or 40 years. I don't mind him trying, but I think President Trump made a really big mistake. When we had the TPP that the U.S. had essentially adopted, President Trump, in the first 2 or 3 weeks of becoming president, abrogated it. We walked away from an agreement which was essentially 12 countries, including the U.S., and not China, where they could essentially act as a counterweight to China's military and economic presence in Asia and around the world. So it's sort of like, at this point, we're trying to impose tariffs with one hand tied behind our back.
Well, a lot of the farmers that I've talked to, or bourbon manufacturers who are already feeling the squeeze from these tariffs, Dennis, say that they're concerned not only with the actual tariff, but then those qualitative measures. For instance, Chinese inspectors holding their stuff up at the port so that the soybeans are rotting in port rather than getting to the buyers. How instrumental can those qualitative measures be in putting pressure on the United States to come to the table and come up with some deal that's acceptable to China and acceptable to the United States as well?
That's a great question, because in the long run, China has a $376 billion deficit. In other words, they can only put so many tariffs to counter the Trump tariffs on what's going there. The only thing they're really left with is the ability to say, all right, if you're bringing into port in Shanghai a shipment of televisions, we can inspect it in a day, or we can inspect it in a week, or we could take a month to do it. And these kind of non-tariff barriers which the Chinese can impose. There's another thing. There are a lot of joint ventures between American companies and Chinese companies. Oftentimes you will find that the Chinese entity in a joint venture will be influenced by the Chinese government to make it more difficult on their partner. So it's where I think China really has the upper hand over us.
Need a 5-word answer, Dennis. Who blinks first, Trump or Xi?
I think Trump blinks first. The reason is the Chinese, if they are patient, can wait for a long time, up to 2 or 3 years, when President Trump has to rerun. I think the U.S. will get a few concessions, but I think Trump blinks first.
Our region's business, improving our economy, creating jobs, and strengthening communities. Innovation, collaboration, transformation, and the people making it happen. Join us as we take a closer look at our region's business. Now, here's your host, Bill Flanagan.
Today on Our Region's Business, no matter how trade negotiations turn out between the U.S. and China, we'll find out why it may just be the beginning of a rivalry 500 years in the making. Plus, a startup based right here in our region brings augmented reality to simulation training for healthcare professionals. And Junior Achievement's big bid to improve career education here through a new BizTown in South Fayette. But first, Asia Ascending. That's the title of a new book by a Pittsburgh lawyer and author who maintains that the current trade dispute between the U.S. and China is simply a sign of things to come. Dennis Unkovic is back with us. He's international law partner with Meyer, Unkovic & Scott in Pittsburgh and author of Asia Ascending. Welcome. Good to have you here. Welcome back.
Good morning, Bill. Nice to be back.
Yeah, let's start with the title of the book, Asia Ascending. Why did you choose that title? What's happening out there that makes this the appropriate?
30 years ago, nobody knew or cared much about Asia and China. Today, you will find over the next 50 years, the future of the world is going to be dominated by the size of the economy over there. You've got 1.3 billion people in China, you've got 1.1 or 1.2 billion people in India, and a lot of other folks. And so while Europe, after World War II, grew along with America and dominated the world economy, it's changed. Asia is ascending. Factually, Asia is now there, and that's why I wanted to write the book.
Yeah, but it's clearly more than a numbers game, because they've had 1 billion plus people for that whole period of time. What's begun to happen that suddenly has made them the force they appear to be emerging to be?
China made a bet in the mid-1980s that they would no longer be a centrally controlled economy. The deal was you, private industry within China, can do whatever you want as long as you stay out of politics. So China grew between 9 and 12% over a period of 30 years. To put that in perspective, if you grow at 8.5% per year, over 8 years, you double your economy. So how many times has the Chinese economy doubled? And India has grown more slowly, but it too is growing very quickly.
India didn't make the same bet at the same time toward...
Really good point. The Indians for years, because they were dominated by the British, said, no, we're going to do it the Indian way. That wasn't working very well. They saw China growing and they were staying the same. So about 20 years ago, the Indians started to do a more outbound trade, and they doubled the size of their economy.
So they were late to the party, but accelerated.
Late to the party, but they're beginning to catch up.
Yeah, so where does that put us? I mean, China, my gosh, is 4 times the size of just the United States. Obviously, North America as a whole is a little bigger than that, but 4 times our size. Clearly, there's a huge trade deficit. How likely, given the dynamics and the population and all the growth we're talking about, is it that the president, that the administration is going to be able to resolve this trade dispute that's currently underway?
Well, last year, 18, we had a deficit with the Chinese of almost $400 billion. So they sold us more stuff than we bought from them. But the problem with that is that we are so intertwined with the Chinese, our economies. If you have an Apple phone in your pocket or any of these other phones, they're all coming from that part of the world. And so the ability to force the Chinese to do anything, we don't have the power anymore. Now, if we and the Europeans got together as allies, which we're really not too close today, unfortunately, and wanted to negotiate with the Chinese, but the Chinese are now trying to be what the United States was at the beginning of the 20th century. They were moving from a more agricultural to an industrial economy, and now they're really just blowing the doors off it. If we say to the Chinese, we won't do business with you anymore, at the end of the day, the Chinese will say, okay, I'll do business with the Europeans, I'll do business in Africa, I'll do business in Central and South America. In America, you can just sit there. So we have to somehow, as a country, figure out a way to negotiate a better trade deal with them without causing dislocations. And you've followed the stock market the last couple of weeks. It's not been very favorable. And I think as a result of that, you're going to see more pressure on the stock market going down because of the intertwined nature of the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy.
But in your view, even though the Chinese, they sell a lot of stuff here, which means they need access to our market, but they don't need it as much as they once did.
Yes. It used to be if they didn't trade with the United States, their economy would collapse. But the Chinese are now looking at 2025, 5-6 years from now. They're building a railway that will go from China through the Central Asian republics into Europe. You used to have to put something on a ship in Shanghai, ship it down around India, around Africa, and eventually get up and get into Europe. Now they'll be able to do that in about 16 days once this thing is built. And so trade, as things moved, has changed. And while they were sort of landlocked, you know, and we had our strong economic sphere there. The other problem we did is, unfortunately, President Trump, in my opinion, walked away from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was going to be 11 countries plus the U.S., not China, that were going to form an economic bloc in Asia. By walking away with it, the Chinese have said, thank you very much. What we're going to do now is we're going to create a closer political, economic relationship with the countries in Southeast Asia, and they have. So the U.S. role in Asia, which I hope will remain important, has diminished over the last couple of years, and I think we have to somehow boost it up.
I remember 30 years ago, we seemed to be having these same kinds of conversations about Japan. We were sure, you know, given what happened in Pittsburgh here with the collapse of our industry and all the issues of foreign competition, that Japan was going to eat our lunch. I mean, that seemed to settle down over time. What's happening?
It was really simple. There are 150 million Japanese. There are 1.3 billion Chinese. And so the size of the Chinese economy dwarfs what Japan was then and what it was now. Japan will always be a strong trader. It's the third largest economy in the world. But as it comes down, China's number 2, as you know. We're number 1. But India's number 6. It's going to move up.
Fascinating stuff. It's covered in the new book, Asia Ascending, by Dennis Unkovic.
Thank you for having me, Bill. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Next up, JA BizTown, a new approach to career awareness that's coming to our region. Please stay with us.
In a typical negotiation, you have one person who can make a decision or move the deal forward. In China, everything is collective, so you really don't know who the most powerful person in the room is. I've been in negotiations with Chinese government officials, and essentially they get together often, they confer, and then they come back with the answer or the response. And so it's not like a private negotiation.
But is there any question here other than Mr. Liu He is the head guy in this negotiation? That's who the president apparently is going to, obviously there'll be others in the room, but that's the point person here.
Well, Vice Premier Hu, who is one of the 4 vice premiers in China, will be meeting with the president, I guess, in a couple of minutes. He's very close to Xi Jinping, but he alone would not have the ability, in my opinion, to make a commitment unless he had already cleared it with Xi Jinping. So my guess is they were hot on the phones last night talking about what would happen in a few minutes.
When we were together a couple of years ago, right after the current president of China took over, you said this person is different. He is a different kind of leader. He is the most powerful leader of China since Mao. Does he have not the power to make a deal, but the power to not make a deal and run out the clock on President Trump?
Yes, he does. There are 2 reasons. First of all, he does not have any political opposition within the country, and he literally could be the head of China for the next, let's say, 20 years. Secondly, and more importantly, Xi is a guy who has a focus on the long-term interests of China. And if you look at the U.S. political system, literally within the next 6 months, the U.S. is going to have to decide one way or the other what it does with China. Xi has enough power, political, economic, and within the bureaucracy to hold out for another year. So that's why he's more powerful than the president, because of his ability to say, okay, I'm not going to make a decision yet.
Dennis, the thorniest issues in these trade talks have been anything concerning intellectual property, and a major sticking point is trying to craft some sort of memorandum of understanding or some sort of agreement, which would also include the element of enforcement. How can you, in your view, craft that into any sort of agreement without making the Chinese feel like they're being policed, which I would imagine would be a deal breaker?
Well, I actually have a suggestion that I was thinking about last night. Now, Lighthizer and München obviously haven't called me. But what I would do is if you have an issue of the forced intellectual property transfer, which is what they're worried about, I would say to the Chinese, look, you say you're not responsible, we think you are. Why don't we transfer for the next 24 months to Singapore, for example, independent arbitration. They have something called the Singapore International Arbitration Center, and let's let someone else other than you or us in neither of our countries do it. If you really wanted to put it to the Chinese, you're going to say, why don't we see what happens over the next 24 months? That's what I would recommend if asked.
Kayla Tausche just reported that the number that is being floated around in additional Chinese purchases of U.S. goods is something on the order of $1.2 trillion over, I believe it's the next decade. I'm not sure that the time period was specified. Does that number smell right to you? No. First of all, we have to be able to sell them things that they want to buy that are ours. If you look at the money, the things that we sent to the Chinese, about a third of it was aerospace, part of it was electronics, and with the total 40% were telephones. There's only so much of our stuff that the Chinese can buy. So them promising over the next 10 years I'll buy $1 trillion worth of things, I think that's unenforceable. I'd rather have the Chinese say, look, over the next 18 months, we will reduce the trade deficit between China and the United States by 15%. That would be $50 billion. I would personally rather see the Chinese commit to that than have them say, over the next 10 years, I'm going to spend $1 trillion. I think goals in life are better when they're set in a smaller time frame that you can really measure. Let me take the first question. I think it's already too late for some American companies that haven't already started to do it. In the short run, if you have a supply chain of products, whatever you're making in China and sending it out, what you need to do is probably right now order extra amounts of inventory, maybe 2 or 3 months, and then get it out of China and put it somewhere in the Philippines or in Japan or Korea, somewhere else, so that if there is this war gets much hotter over the next few weeks or few months, that at least you can carry the supply chain. In the longer run, I work with a lot of companies who are no longer just manufacturing in China, which they did exclusively for a long time, but now they're trying to find other places in Asia where they can do the manufacturing, even if it's slightly more expensive. But that takes a long time. That can take months, if not years, to effectuate.
It would take at least a year, in my opinion, to find a reliable supplier, Tyler, outside of China who could do your work. So that's something they should already be doing right now. But in the short run, it would make sense to order extra inventory that you can put offshore so that you can at least buy time. Kelly had someone on her earlier program, The Exchange, when they were talking about this. Generally, what I've learned, and I think all experts know, is that there's no silver bullet here. You simply have to deal with the situation as it arises. But are China and the U.S. headed toward a confrontation? I think the answer is yes.
So let's talk a little bit about this war of nerves, if nothing else. One difference between the United States and China, even I understand this, is China is not a democracy. President Xi does not have to face the polls, the electorate, in 2020. President Trump does. Does that suggest that if the pressure gets too high, that the President of the United States will be the one who seeks a deal before the President of China does?
That's a terrific question. Xi Jinping is the single most powerful political leader in the world because he doesn't have any bosses. He doesn't have to answer to Congress, doesn't have to answer to the judiciary. So what he can do is if he gets his back up, and the Chinese, by the way, are very emotional people. They're not the stoic Chinese that you read about, and they are very proud, they're very nationalistic. So if President Trump says, you must do this or else, the Chinese will sit back and wait, because the one thing President Trump, I think, needs to be reelected is a strong U.S. economy and stock market. And if they tank over the next 6 to 8 months, it's obviously going to adversely affect his election prospects. So if I were in the Trump administration, obviously he hasn't asked me my opinion, but if he did, I'd say, look, get the best deal you can that you think puts the United States in a better position now than it was 6 months ago, and say, fine, let's go forward.
So let's talk a little bit about something we were not dancing around. We addressed it directly at the top of the broadcast, and that is the idea that there are some who are presumably still advising the president who see the confrontation, the collision between China and the United States as far more than just about trade, that it is a kind of Cold War competition, collision of two systems, of two military powers, of two countries that have stakes regionally, if not globally. How do you see that? Is this more than just about trade?
Yes. In the long run, China will have a larger economy than the United States, I'd guess in about 4 years. But the Chinese have 4 times as many people. But the U.S. essentially was unchallenged economically for the last 30 or 40 years. Russia, as you know, has shrunk and continues to shrink. So the next big guy in the room is going to be China. And so anyone who thinks that this is just about tariffs or trade, I think, is fooling themselves. But that's an especially important reason why, when you get into a dispute, you want to make sure that you're not doing things that push people or things over the precipice. That's why I think the president, in threatening China to saying, you must do this or else, is making a mistake. Because the Chinese are very strong. They're not as strong as we are, but they're not kids anymore. They're not teenagers. They're grown-ups. And we have to deal with them in a sophisticated way.
And they are very resolute. I mean, they are very resolute. You made a very, I think, telling point earlier. They are a proud people who felt aggrieved over the domination of the West and other powers for centuries, really.
Well, Tyler, if you go into a Chinese school, you know, in America we learn to pledge allegiance to the flag. But in China they talk about the century of humiliation, which was between 1852 and 1949, when the West, essentially the U.S., France, Russia, essentially put pressure on the Chinese and took it over. At that time, the Chinese have been very embarrassed. And what Xi Jinping has done, to his credit, is he said to the Chinese people, we will not allow this to happen again. Right. They have what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they want to essentially build a Silk Road between China into Europe. What's the year they want to complete that? 2049. Exactly 100 years after the Chinese Communist Party took over China. China's very proud, and you have to deal with them straight and honestly and not try to push them around too much.
I think one of the reasons you think that this outbreak could be in its early innings and far more deleterious to the global economy is that when you look back at SARS in 2003, China was a small hunk of GDP. It was not as integrated into the global economy, 6 or 7% of global GDP. Now it's 17 or 18%. That is an exponential potential magnification of what this could mean, right?
That's absolutely right. The real problem here is that SARS was about 4 to 6 months and then it tailed off. We aren't even approaching, as I can see it, where this particular coronavirus is going. And with China now being so carefully integrated into the world economy, this 16 to 17% of GDP that the Chinese produce could have an effect not just in China, but clearly in the United States. I'm really very worried.
I have to believe that one of the reasons some or even many companies, including American companies that do business over there, are postponing, or American contractors who do business over there, are postponing the return of workers, is that those workers often will be coming back from their holiday and resuming residence in extraordinarily close quarters in dormitories that are owned by their employer company. And that could be a breeding ground for this virus.
A typical Chinese, Tyler, a typical Chinese business is a dormitory, they have a cafeteria, and they have an office building or a factory where they work. They're together 24/7, usually working 6 days a week. Bringing them back is not just going to put the factories back in business, but it essentially would be a breeding ground for the coronavirus. So when they were talking a few days ago about, well, let's look at February 8th, we're going to be back up in production, that was fantasy. It simply will not happen. And I'm glad to see the Chinese government has taken the steps to extend what was the New Year's holiday. But I think it was just announced a few minutes ago, I don't know if you've seen this, but Guangzhou, which is the 5th largest city in Japan, in China, has now been locked down, 15 million people, and that's in the middle of the Pearl River Delta, which is near Hong Kong. It's essentially southern China. So we see the focus moving, in my view, from Wuhan, which is in central China, now to essentially southeast China. It's really not very good news.
Dennis, that raises an important question for the supply chain, which is, does this add insult to injury for those looking to source outside of China? We spoke about this a little bit last hour, and Michelle's point is that there's just not a lot of places to go. And while that may be true, does this continue to, suggest to anybody dependent on getting stuff from China that they better have a plan B?
Two answers. Yes, they need to have a plan B. Malaysia, Singapore for highly sophisticated things, Vietnam, they're possibilities. But the second point is there's a problem. To change, I'm working with a company now who wants to move some of its production from China into Malaysia. That's going to take 12 to 18 months. So while it's a good idea to diversify, split up your sources of production, it's simply not going to be possible. That's why this particular virus will be so serious. So even if you started today to move a manufacturing facility to Malaysia, it probably would take you 12 to 18 months.
You make the point that large companies, whether it's a Foxconn or some derivative of a company of that scale, will probably be able to ride out this kind of economic corrosion, but that a lot, maybe millions of small Chinese manufacturers or merchants will not, because they've taken a double whammy. The tariffs didn't help them, and now this. This could really do what we would call grassroots damage to the Chinese economy.
That's a great point. The Foxconn has over 500,000 employees. It will be okay. It can borrow money. But most of these smaller companies that are manufacturing in China are owned by individuals. They don't have credit lines. And every week that the factory is closed, they either have to continue to pay their employees if they're there, or they're going to lose money. And China, as you know, has a debt crisis at this time. And so the major banks simply don't loan to these smaller companies. And so they're really in a bad position, because the Trump tariffs made them take their small margins and make them even smaller. And as a result, it'll be difficult for a lot of them to hang on. The end result is, in the supply chain, fewer suppliers, higher prices, or maybe no goods at all.
What are you hearing from China? You pointed to the real danger zone, business-wise, in China was not the large state-owned enterprises, but it was the smaller and medium-sized businesses that don't have the cash flow or the capital bulwark against this virus.
That's right. Thank you for having me back, Tyler. What I've learned is that the small companies are increasingly in serious situations. The Chinese government 2 days ago, I guess it was Tuesday, excuse me, they announced a 500 billion renminbi, which is, I guess, about 72 billion US dollars, that they're offering to small and medium-sized businesses to refinance their debt. And you were talking in the last segment about whether or not fiscal policy will help. Well, the Chinese are obviously extremely worried about that. Otherwise, why would they say, we're going to extend your loans, we're going to refinance you? Because the biggest problem in China is unemployment. If these small companies go out of business, aside from them not doing business, the Chinese government is faced with a populace that is increasingly unemployed. And that's something that a centrally controlled economy like theirs simply cannot accept.
As you look around the globe, I would think that there would be similar movements afoot in other countries, particularly Italy, potentially, where the economy must be slowing. You must be hearing similar things there.
Well, I had a talk just a few minutes ago with a client of mine in Italy near Milan. And what he said to me is the coronavirus at this point seems to be contained to the few cities. But he said the real challenge for him and for Italy is their recreational, their tourism. Italy is the 8th largest economy in the world, ahead of Russia and Canada, and at $2 trillion. 13% of their economy is now related to tourism. I spoke to someone earlier today who told me that in Venice, which is really not in the part of Italy which is being affected by the coronavirus, that the hotels there have experienced a 40% cancellation rate. And if you take that and you put it across Italy, and as you know, most of Europe goes south rather than north during the summer season, Italy could be very badly hurt. Their economy, as you know, is not particularly strong, so this could be a very serious thing.
As you look at China, how quickly do you think it could bounce back? In other words, you've had an economy that has basically gone to zero in this first quarter so far. It largely stopped. How quickly could it bounce back?
I don't think it can bounce back as quickly as we would like. Let me give you an example. Whenever they have their New Year's celebration, workers leave and they go back to their homes. Normally, about 80% of them return, and then they have to hire new workers. This year, from what I understand, instead of the 15 to 20% not coming back, now it's more like 40%. I know of one company in southern China that I can't disclose. They have about 1,400 employees. Normally, they would lose 200, 250. This year, they're down to 850. But the interesting thing is only 650 of the people who have come back worked for them before. So they had to hire another 250 people. The problem in supply chain is two things. First of all, productivity, which is down. You have to retrain the people. And secondly, quality. So I think that it's going to be a longer road for the Chinese to come back. I'm not optimistic.